The British trusted him completely. Washington trusted him completely. Only one side was making a terrible mistake. In the summer of 1781, the fate of the American Revolution rested on information. Not cannons, not muskets. Information. Every conversation, every order, every movement of British troops could determine whether the revolution survived or disappeared forever. By 1781, the American Revolution had entered its 6th year. Neither side had achieved the decisive victory it desperately needed. The war had become one of endurance and exhaustion. For years, the fighting had stretched from New England to the Carolinas. Now, the conflict was moving toward Virginia. Both armies understood that whatever happened here could decide the future of an entire continent. The British believed Virginia held the key to ending the rebellion. Its rivers supplied trade, its farms fed armies, its roads connected nearly every major campaign in the South. If Virginia fell, the revolution itself might follow. Leading part of that campaign was a man whose very name had become synonymous with betrayal: Benedict Arnold. Once one of America's most celebrated generals, he now fought for the British crown. His knowledge of Patriot defenses made him uniquely dangerous. Arnold's raids left towns in flames. Military supplies disappeared. Communication collapsed. Fear spread faster than the armies themselves. Virginia was no longer preparing for war. Virginia was living through it. Hundreds of miles away, George Washington faced an impossible problem. The Continental Army could fight, but it could not fight blindly. To defeat the British, Washington first needed to understand them. Intelligence became as valuable as gunpowder. Every intercepted letter, every eyewitness report, every reliable informant could save thousands of lives or doom an entire campaign. To command American forces in Virginia, Washington relied upon a young French general, the Marquis de Lafayette. Only 23 years old, yet entrusted with one of the most dangerous assignments of the war. Lafayette faced an enemy that often knew more than he did. British troops moved quickly. Their intentions remained uncertain. Reliable intelligence was desperately scarce. Without it, every decision became a gamble. The surviving correspondence reveals a commander searching constantly for information. Not rumors, not guesses, facts. The kind of knowledge that could only come from inside the British camp itself. The solution would not come from another general, nor from an experienced officer. It would come from a man whose name appears only briefly in the surviving records, before changing the course of the war. The archives preserve remarkably little about his first 3 decades. No childhood diary, no personal letters, no detailed biography. Only fragments, scattered across petitions, military endorsements, and government records. From those fragments, a remarkable story begins to emerge. Not the story of a famous general, nor a celebrated politician, but of a man history almost allowed to disappear. Before he became one of the revolution's most valuable intelligence agents, he first had to accomplish something almost impossible. He had to convince the British that he was exactly what they expected him to be. To them, he was invisible, a servant, an enslaved man, someone beneath suspicion. That assumption would become the greatest intelligence failure of the British campaign. The documents tell us what he did. They do not tell us what he thought, but they leave little doubt about the risks. If his deception failed, there would be no prisoner exchange, no military trial, only death. Long before British officers unknowingly trusted him, before George Washington depended upon his intelligence, James Armistead was simply another enslaved man in colonial Virginia. And that is where the historical record becomes unusually quiet. Unlike generals, politicians, or wealthy landowners, James left behind no diary, no personal correspondence, no account of his childhood. The archives preserve only fragments, and sometimes those silences tell their own story. Most historians believe James was born around 1748 in New Kent County, Virginia. The date comes not from a birth record, but from a petition he submitted decades later, describing himself as 70 years old. For countless enslaved people, even the date of birth was rarely considered important enough to record. His daily responsibilities remain uncertain, but surviving evidence suggests he lived and worked on the estate of William Armistead, a Virginia planter whose responsibilities would unexpectedly place James close to the machinery of war. William Armistead was more than a plantation owner. He also managed military supplies for Virginia. As the Revolution intensified, wagons, provisions, horses, and government stores moved constantly through his network. War had arrived at the plantation gate. That connection matters because it placed James within reach of information, soldiers, and military logistics, long before he ever entered a British camp. By 1781, Virginia itself had become a battlefield. British raids devastated towns. Plantations feared confiscation. Merchants feared bankruptcy. Ordinary civilians no longer wondered whether the war would reach them. It already had. Benedict Arnold's campaign spread panic throughout the colony. His knowledge of Patriot defenses allowed British forces to strike with alarming precision. Every successful raid raised the same question. How could the Americans stop an enemy they could barely see? Washington needed intelligence. Lafayette needed intelligence. Without reliable information, every military decision became little more than an educated guess. Somewhere amid this growing crisis, James made a decision that would change his life. The surviving records tell us he received permission from William Armistead to join the American forces under the Marquis de Lafayette. Why that permission was granted, the archives never explain. Historians have proposed several possibilities: Patriot loyalty, military necessity, perhaps an arrangement never written down. The evidence simply does not survive. And where evidence ends, responsible history must stop. What the documents do confirm is that by the summer of 1781, James entered Lafayette's service, not as a soldier, not as an officer, but for what later records described as the most secret and important kind. Exactly how James and Lafayette first met has not survived, but the consequences of that meeting certainly have. Within weeks, James would receive an assignment unlike any other in the Continental Army. The mission demanded more than courage. It demanded patience, observation, memory, and the ability to disappear in plain sight. He would carry no musket, no military commission, no visible proof that he served the American cause. If captured, there would be nothing to distinguish him from an ordinary runaway. His disguise would rely upon one cruel reality of 18th century America. British officers expected enslaved men to seek freedom behind their lines. James intended to give them exactly what they expected to see. Every step carried extraordinary risk. If the British believed his story, he would enter one of the most heavily guarded military camps in North America. If they did not, his mission would end before it had truly begun. The next time British officers looked at James Armistead, they believed they were seeing a desperate runaway. In reality, they had just welcomed one of the most effective intelligence agents of the American Revolution. Every successful intelligence operation begins with a single moment. The moment when someone decides whether to believe you. For James Armistead, that moment had arrived. His disguise required almost no costume. An enslaved man, alone, without weapons, claiming to have fled the Americans. It was exactly the story British officers expected to hear. The British Army had encouraged enslaved people to escape Patriot plantations throughout the war. Every new arrival represented another worker, another guide, another potential source of information. James intended to become all three. The surviving records indicate that James first entered the camp of Benedict Arnold. No transcript survives of their first conversation. No witness recorded every question. But later evidence leaves little doubt about the outcome. His deception worked. This was no ordinary commander. Benedict Arnold understood deception better than almost anyone alive. He had built his reputation and destroyed it through betrayal. If anyone might recognize another deception, it was him. Spies rarely gather secrets by asking questions. They listen, they watch, they remember. The most valuable intelligence often comes from conversations never intended for them. Because British officers considered James beneath suspicion, they often behaved as though he wasn't there at all. Orders were discussed openly, routes examined, supply problems debated. To them, he remained invisible. The records never claimed James possessed extraordinary abilities, only extraordinary discipline. Every road, every regiment, every passing remark had to be remembered. Nothing could be written down. At carefully chosen moments, that information traveled back to American commanders. Exactly how each meeting occurred remains uncertain. The surviving documents preserve the results, not every method. Again and again, James's reports reached the Marquis de Lafayette. Years later, Lafayette himself would describe those reports as industriously collected and more faithfully delivered. It was remarkable praise from one of the Revolution's most respected commanders. Success created an unexpected opportunity. The more useful James appeared, the more freedom he received inside the British camp. His greatest disguise had become credibility itself. Then, the campaign entered a new phase. Lord Charles Cornwallis assumed command of British operations in Virginia. With him came larger armies, greater responsibilities, and even more valuable intelligence. Cornwallis believed victory was within reach. His army remained disciplined. British reinforcements were expected. The rebellion, he believed, could finally be crushed. Somewhere during this campaign, something remarkable happened. According to the surviving evidence, Cornwallis came to trust James so completely that he assigned him intelligence work on Britain's behalf.
Good. The plan.
The British commander believed James would spy on the Americans. Instead, every assignment carried him precisely where Lafayette needed him to go. It was one of the most extraordinary reversals of trust in revolutionary history. Both armies believed James worked for them. Only
Troops,
one
advance!
was correct.
Into the light!
By late summer, every road in Virginia led toward a place few soldiers yet realized would define the American Revolution: Yorktown. And James Armistead was about to deliver the intelligence that helped make that battle possible. By late summer of 1781, the war had become a race. Every army was moving, every commander was calculating, and every hour mattered. Lord Cornwallis believed he understood his enemy. The Americans lacked supplies. Their army was exhausted. Victory, he believed, depended only on choosing the right battlefield. The documents suggest that James remained close enough to British headquarters to observe discussions of troop movements and military intentions. It was exactly the intelligence Lafayette had been desperate to obtain. The surviving records rarely describe how intelligence moved between camps. They preserve the outcome, not every method. But they leave little doubt that James's reports reached American commanders with remarkable consistency. Each report sharpened the American understanding of British plans. Roads became clearer. Supply routes became visible. The uncertainty that had haunted Lafayette for months slowly began to disappear. Washington had made a bold decision. Rather than attack New York, he would march south. French and American forces would unite in Virginia. If Cornwallis could be trapped, the war itself might be brought to an end. The success of that plan depended upon precise timing. French warships had to seal the Chesapeake. American troops had to arrive before British reinforcements. Every movement required accurate intelligence. Every delay threatened disaster. Across Virginia, 4 men were shaping history: Washington, Lafayette, Cornwallis, and an enslaved intelligence agent, moving unnoticed between them. Cornwallis believed Yorktown offered security, deep water access, defensive earthworks, the possibility of rescue by the Royal Navy. It appeared to be a strong position. In reality, it was becoming a trap. By September, the trap had almost completely closed. American and French armies surrounded the town. The French fleet controlled the sea. Cornwallis found himself isolated. The siege of Yorktown was won through courage, through artillery, through international cooperation. But it was also won through information. Commanders could only act upon what they knew, and James had helped them know. Years later, the Marquis de Lafayette would remember James's contribution in remarkably direct language. He certified that James had rendered essential service, and that his intelligence had been industriously collected and more faithfully delivered. For a commander known for careful judgment, those were extraordinary words. On October 19th, 1781, Lord Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The fighting would continue elsewhere for a time, but the military outcome of the revolution had effectively been decided. The British campaign in America had collapsed. For thousands of soldiers, victory had finally arrived. Years of sacrifice had been rewarded. A new nation seemed within reach. But James Armistead did not return home as a celebrated hero. He returned home still enslaved. The revolution had secured independence for the United States. it had not secured freedom for the man who helped make that victory possible. The most dangerous mission of James Armistead's life was over. His most difficult battle was about to begin. History remembers Yorktown as the victory that secured American independence. For James Armistead, it marked the beginning of a very different struggle. The man who had crossed enemy lines, earned the confidence of Cornwallis, and delivered intelligence praised by Lafayette, returned to the legal status he had held before the war. He returned as an enslaved man. In 1783, Virginia passed legislation granting freedom to many enslaved men who had served in the Continental Army. At first glance, it appeared that James had finally earned his liberty.
No.
But the law contained a devastating limitation. The statute recognized soldiers. James had never officially been one. He carried intelligence, not a musket. The law that rewarded military service did not recognize espionage. It is one of the most striking paradoxes of the American Revolution. A man who had helped secure liberty for a nation remained legally classified as property. The archives suggest James petitioned the Virginia legislature as early as 1784. That petition has not survived, only the official record that it once existed. For reasons history never explains, nothing changed. 2 years later, James tried again. On November 30th, 1786, he submitted another petition. This time, the evidence survives. James did not ask for charity. He asked the Commonwealth of Virginia to recognize documented service already performed. His argument rested not on emotion, but on evidence. Supporting that petition was one of the most extraordinary endorsements of the Revolutionary era. The Marquis de Lafayette personally testified on James's behalf. Lafayette wrote, "This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential service to me." He continued, "His intelligences from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and more faithfully delivered." For historians, this document is priceless. It is the commanding general himself confirming the work of his spy. The testimony succeeded. In January 1787, the Virginia General Assembly passed an act granting James his freedom. After years of risking his life for American independence, James finally secured his own. Soon afterward, he adopted a new surname, Lafayette. Not as an act of servitude, but as a lasting tribute to the commander who had refused to let his service be forgotten. The archives become quieter once again, but they do not fall silent. Instead, they reveal a life patiently rebuilt. Tax records from 1816 identify James Lafayette as a landowner in New Kent County. For a man born into slavery, ownership represented more than property. It represented legal personhood. Years later, Virginia granted James a pension for his revolutionary service. The Commonwealth had finally begun acknowledging the contribution it had once overlooked. Then, more than 40 years after Yorktown, history offered one final scene. Among thousands gathered to welcome the aging French hero, Lafayette recognized one familiar face: James. Newspapers recorded the remarkable reunion. The celebrated general stopped his procession, crossed the crowd, and embraced the man who had once served him in secret. For a brief moment, history remembered them together. James Armistead Lafayette died on August 9, 1830. He left behind no memoir, no collection of letters, no account of what he experienced behind British lines. His story survives because others documented what he accomplished. The surviving records reveal a remarkable truth. One of the American Revolution's most effective intelligence agents was a man whom history nearly overlooked. He fought without a battlefield commission. He served without public recognition. And for years, he lived without the freedom he had helped secure for others. History often celebrates the generals who planned victories and the armies that won them. But sometimes, the fate of nations turns on someone whose name appears only briefly in the archives. James Armistead Lafayette reminds us that history is not shaped only by those who stand in the spotlight. Sometimes, it is changed by the person no one thought to notice. For more than 2 centuries, James Armistead Lafayette's story remained hidden in military records, legislative petitions, and a single handwritten testimonial. Yet those surviving documents tell us that one overlooked intelligence agent helped shape the outcome of the American Revolution. At Forgotten Ages, our goal is not simply to revisit history, but to return to the archives, examine the evidence, and bring forgotten lives back into the conversation. If you enjoyed this investigation, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey into history's overlooked chapters. And before you go, here is one question worth considering. How many other people changed the course of history without ever appearing in the textbooks? Until next time, thank you for watching.